In the last video, we discussed line and how line can convey meaning. In this video, I'm going to be talking about space. We'll see how lines can help to create space, but we'll also discuss some other ways of creating space in a work of art. In order to understand space, it's important to understand the difference between shapes and forms. A shape is an outline of an object. It's flat. Its boundaries are measured in height and width. It's two-dimensional. So we're looking at some shapes at the top of this slide here. This differs from mass or form. Form is a solid that occupies three-dimensional volume. So this is measured in height, width, and depth. So we can see that we've got forms here at the bottom. The major shapes are circles, squares, triangles, these shapes listed here. The major forms are spheres, cylinders, cubes, pyramids, the forms listed here. We can create forms by using linear perspective. We'll be discussing two kinds of linear perspective. One-point linear perspective, or as is listed here, single-point linear perspective, and two-point linear perspective. In one-point linear perspective, lines are drawn on the picture plane in such a way as to represent parallel lines receding to a single point on the viewer's horizon. And this single point is called the vanishing point. The vanishing point is positioned in relationship to the vantage point, or in many ways it's positioned in opposition to the vantage point. So the vantage point is where the viewer is standing. And the viewer is standing on the opposite side of the vanishing point. The vanishing point is where all of the diagonal lines recede. This is the point to which all of the diagonal lines recede. And so you can see all of these parallel horizontal lines, which to us register as diagonal lines. From our point of view, they register as diagonal lines. They all recede here to this single point. As I mentioned, the recession of these lines is diagonal, and if the vanishing point is directly across from the vantage point, the recession would be more frontal. In two-point linear perspective, there is one set of lines that's parallel to the picture plane and two sets of lines that are oblique to it. The parallel lines oblique to the picture plane converge to a single vanishing point, and this means that the setup will require two vanishing points. Another way of saying this is that in two-point linear perspective, parallel lines along the width and depth of an object are represented as meeting in two separate points on the horizon line that are 90 degrees apart as measured from the common intersection of the lines of projection. So here we're looking at the common intersection of the lines of projection, and you'll notice that the two vanishing points are 90 degrees away from that common line of projection. So we get the idea that this would be 90 degrees here. So the lines, vanish to two different points, basically when you're looking at a picture that features two-point linear perspective, you're looking directly at the corner of the object, of the square or cube here. Whereas with single point linear perspective, one point linear perspective, you're not looking directly at this corner, right? You're kind of looking at the side of the object here, or the front of the object. In parallel projection, lines are parallel in both reality and in the projection plane. With parallel projections, the scale of distant features is the same as for features that are up close. This means that the pictures will look distorted. So here, these lines aren't receding at all into the background, so it looks a little odd. Foreshortening is the visual distortion or compression of an object when seen from a particular viewpoint. This illustrates perspective and the recession of an object into space. So you could see here the body of Christ in Andrea Mantegna's The Lamentation. Looks pretty distorted to us, right? He looks like he's got this really short abdomen, really short legs. His feet, if we were actually looking at his body, his feet would have to be much bigger than Mantegna has depicted, but he's shrunk them in order for us to really view the entire body of Christ, this foreshortened body of Christ. This little visual might give you a better idea. So if we're looking at an object from a bird's eye view, we can see the whole shape of the object. We could measure the length of the object, we could measure the width of the object. But if we're looking at this object from the side, if we're looking at it from this foreshortened perspective, the length of the lake appears to us to be shorter here than it does here. So if we measured this distance on a flat image, it would be shorter than the actual distance of the image. So foreshortening is an optical illusion, but it really does help us to interpret space. It suggests deep space as opposed to shallow space. Let's take a look at positive shapes and negative shapes. In two-dimensional works, positive shapes are enclosed objects in the work. These objects are defined by other elements, such as lines or colors. And the area around the positive shapes, or the background, the defining elements, are negative. So when we're looking at this work by Wesselmann, by Tom Wesselmann, the female figure is the positive shape here. So she appears to be this shape that's enclosed by other elements. She's kind of the subject of the work. And this contrasts with the negative shapes. So these shapes that are created by her body in some instances, and then the shape that also helps to create her body. It's kind of like the inverse here. We're looking at the positive and then the negative. In order to help you understand this a little bit better, we can also think about positive space and negative space. For instance, we've got Henry Moore's double oval here. This is a solid piece of sculpture. So this occupies positive three-dimensional space. That means that all of the areas surrounding it, the atmosphere, the air surrounding the sculpture is negative space. So if we were to actually encounter this sculpture in real life, we could stick our arm through this hole here. So we'd be sticking our arm through negative space. We couldn't stick our arm through this big sculpture here, though. We would just touch it, which of course we wouldn't really want to touch it. So we could think about that in relationship to Wesselmann's two-dimensional work of art, right? It's as though we could stick our arm between this woman's legs, but then we would hit her body here if we tried to stick our arm through this positive space. So in two-dimensional works, we're looking at positive and negative shapes. Then in three-dimensional works, we're looking at positive space, the space that occupies real space, and then negative space, these spaces that surround the actual object. In Gada Amer's Le Lit from 1997, Amer uses negative space as the subject matter. So you'll see that this mattress she's created has these two, or this one giant hole in the middle. This is negative space, right? The mattress itself is positive. It's actually occupying space, whereas this is kind of air. It's just atmosphere that's here in this cookie cutter version. And traditionally, we see positive space or positive shape making up the subject matter of a work of art, right? So in Henry Moore's sculpture, we've got the positive space that's the subject. In Wesselmann's work here, we've got the female figure, this positive shape that is the subject of the work. But Gada Amer has unusually created this subject, these two human figures, out of negative space. In the final video, I'm going to be talking about how light and color can be used to create a sense of space. So hang out with me for another video, and then we'll move on next week to finish up our discussion of the formal elements.